At the outset of the nationwide invasion, kicking off with the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes occurring at midnight on October the 4th, the external components as they raced across the border were joined by the Trojan shock armies of the Sino-Russian invasion coalition forces emerging from their CCP regime properties that had been in place for many decades as China had purchased these properties as its CCP regime had bought them with the express purpose of utilizing them to establish their Trojan shock forces, including the units of their allies on these properties, as money-making was only a front for what their real objective was with these properties, which was invasion, as they had had plans for many years to conduct said invasion. And the purchase of most of America's major ports was a big indication of this. As for 2 decades, they had patiently built up logistics, vehicles, and more for the Trojan shock units that were within every corner of the nation, many of them disguised as foreign students, and to become a student within the United States from China, even to get an exit visa from China, one would need to either be a current or former member of the PLA or any of China's many paramilitary branches. As to be a student, and there were 5 million within the nation, would add up to the number of Trojans utilized within this hypothetical invasion scenario. Although the failed border policies that have been going on for years simply aided in this, as many of them conducted their troop rotations this way by doing discrete unit rotations through the extremely porous northern and southern borders. Not to mention by air, as they could still infiltrate their units as student groups and business personnel and more. As all of these methods combined made maintaining their presence as it pertained to their Trojan shock forces extremely simple. And at midnight on the 4th, as the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes removed all of America's eyes and ears through its ISR capabilities from satellite-based ISR, as the sudden missile, air, and even overrunning of facilities would negate their drone-based ISR capabilities, not to mention that the crippling of all of their satellite data transfer technologies and electronic jamming from being able to utilize electromagnetic jamming through pinpointing the origin of radio and radar and jamming it with these frequencies, as both China and Russia possessed the most cutting edge in electronic warfare capabilities, including these capabilities, the United States would be completely left in the dark. As the externals rushed across the border as part of third-generation warfare, allowed for there to be a front line that shifted and moved, although behind the front, the invaded country could mobilize in ordinary circumstances its population, and although America had a very limited defense industrial base compared to especially China, but also even Russia, after years of dismantling it, the ability to do this would be extremely impossible with the Trojan shock forces inside the nation, as well as the removal of communications. There would be no front line in fourth generation warfare. There would only be lines of contact. And where enemy forces clashed, essentially, within said lines of contact. As, for example, the American defense industrial base, being as very small as it was, to put that in perspective, one subsidiary of a handful of the Chinese defense industrial base, being Norinco, had 300 enormous mammoth factory compounds. 300 with a 1.5 million square foot production space or larger per plant. That meant that China had a handful of tank plants, for instance, to America's one tank factory in Lima, Ohio, just as an example, to put it in perspective. 1.5 million square feet is the minimum size. So there were many larger plants than that the Chinese possessed. And that's only one subsidiary, being Norinco. There was also China South Group that had a China South Industries Group that had another 200 plus enormous factory complexes of that size or larger. It's Aviation Corporation of China and more. The one tank plant that America possessed in Lima, Ohio was 1.6 million square feet. For perspective. America also lacked a purpose-driven defense industry. It produced equipment with the intent to continually make money by producing parts that would wear out and thus keep these corporations making big money by producing spare parts. Whereas the equipment of China and Russia was more purpose-driven, as it was built to last a lot longer without wearing out. Just being one small comparison as it relates to the forces on the battlefield. The logistical network, in other words, of the American forces wholeheartedly depended upon its industrial base, however small it was for its military industries, up and running, and it could not work without the power grid. And it could not work with enemy forces in every corner of the land within the nation, rapidly overtaking it. It only worked within the military structure and only with what they had on hand, as things broke down rather quickly. Within the Battle of Waco, this being a battle very closely tied to that which was occurring within Fort Hood in this battle, as 3 Corps was beleaguered and embattled by the elements of the 68th PLA Group Army, a reserve PLA Group Army tasked with assisting the elements of the 2nd Russian Combined Arms Army, which also contributed elements to both overcoming rapidly the installation of Fort Hood as well as 3 Corps. As the fighting within Waco, just to the north of the Fort Hood area, was tied to the fighting that occurred against 3 Corps, as the forces present at the Fort Hood battle, some of which would end up, both American and Russian, besides the Chinese forces, as the 68th PLA Group Army was split roughly in half, between half of it involved in the Fort Hood fighting and the other half in the Waco area. Some of the American forces that fled the battlefield early on during the Fort Hood battle would make it into the Waco Battle, while others would end up going towards I-35 and not making it very long at all. And although the other American forces that would end up in the Waco Battle wouldn't make it either, they would last a little bit longer in some cases than their comrades who strayed towards I-35, perhaps one of the most heavily guarded pieces of infrastructure throughout this course of this entire invasion, as this was the most important invasion route for the external forces, as group armies 7 through 13 of this prong of external forces needed I-35 to get deep into the country before fanning out within Kansas to assist the Trojans that were even further inland doing the heavy lifting up there, including even shedding off the 10th PLA Group Army en route to relieve the 58th from within the previous sub-series of this documentary series to go for Tulsa. As the fighting would be very heavy, the distance between Fort Hood and Waco was only a 36-mile distance between Gatesville at the northern end of Fort Hood to Waco. Essentially, it would only take an hour and 15 minutes travel time for the Army vehicles of the American forces fleeing the outset of the combat in Fort Hood, as they fled the initial artillery strikes and some of these strafing attacks, which badly had torn at some of their numbers as they were leaving the installation, as they decided it would be better to get the hell out of there than stay and wait for enemies to physically reach them. As the Russian 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade had to fight through certain units first, allowing other units to flee, which was a wise decision, as it gave them a chance to live a little bit longer. They arrived in another battle at Waco after fleeing the Fort Hood battle, which itself was a medium-sized city with a population of 140,000. Although its metro area possessed over 300,000 people, Waco was of very high importance to the Sino-Russian coalition invasion forces for multiple reasons, not the least of which being its sizable regional airport, and being along I-35, perhaps the single most important of all, the invasion corridors, as mentioned, being utilized by the external invasion prongs to enter the nation. Likewise, being multiple reasons of note for this fact relating to the importance of I-35 as it related to the invaders. Also, Waco was home to a handful of defense contractors, besides it being a key node along I-35 needing to be controlled. Also, its close proximity to Fort Hood itself was of note. And the fact that the 143rd Infantry Regiment of the Texas National Guard had been mobilized and sent to protect the area. Although most of the unit had been assembling in downtown Waco, the 143rd Infantry Regiment, right here, as it pertained to Waco, been assembling downtown by the time of the invasion's outset, they were largely ready to fight when the anti-satellite and tandem cyber attacks had gone down, removing American eyes and ears and even communications with radio, as Waco sat upon the outermost ranges of Chinese electronic warfare targeted electromagnetic jamming assets belonging to the 68th PLA Group Army, a reserve PLA Group Army, itself responsible for both the Fort Hood battle, along with elements of the Russian 2nd Combined Arms Army, and even the Waco battle space as well, as it had roughly split its elements in half to deal with both areas of operations, deploying its strongest subunits in terms of heavy forces, as in the maneuver forces, against Fort Hood, while the forces arrayed against Waco were generally on the lighter side, minus the 8th Independent Brigade. Although the 38th Infantry Brigade was relatively potent, also having an armored battalion as one of its maneuver elements, it was mostly infantry-oriented, with its mechanized infantry and combat engineer battalions. Although all units here in the Waco Battle, going to the Waco map, possessed powerful artillery, the biggest unit was a light unit that was well suited to fighting enemy infantry forces and in certain environments, such as thick jungles or forests or mountains. An example being the Himalayan plateau, for instance. Although similar in some ways, the 3rd Infantry Division took in the Laredo Battle as part of the 10th PLA Group Army, as mentioned, being shed off in the Oklahoma City area to relieve the 58th PLA Group Army, as it also took part in the fighting at the border in Laredo, which took part in the Laredo Battle at the initiation of hostilities on the border. The 288th Light Infantry Division, which was broken up into 2 different regiments, light infantry regiments, and also its light armor brigade, most of which is off map, holding down areas in a crescent around the Waco map, which being a 15 by 15 mile map, its forces were spread out all the way from I-35, just south of this area, to around here, with only its artillery battalion present on the actual battle map. This is a smaller battle map than many of them in terms of the mileage. The 288th Light Infantry Division possessed light tanks within its 13th Light Armored Brigade, which were the brand new Type 15s, the light tanks, whereas the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division did not have any armor of any type, as in no light or definitely main tanks. Being the largest unit within the battle at Waco, the 288th Light Infantry Division was originally, before the invasion had kicked off, to have been disbanded, with its 2 light infantry regiments and light armored brigade reconfigured into light combined arms brigades. This as the 112th Combined Arms Brigade within the 68th PLA Group Army, one of the few reserve group armies going through the 2nd phase of reorganization, which would mostly been already completed with the active military units of the PLA, as many reserve group armies had not done so yet. Only the active group armies was the PLA's 1st Combined Arms Brigade, as a heavy Combined Arms Brigade in formal terms, as it was speaking of the 112th Combined Arms Brigade of the 68th PLA Group Army, the Reserve Group Army. As the heavy artillery fire, loitering munitions, and even strafing attacks from J-11 fighter jets and the FH-97s that joined them in the Fort Hood battle had harried and scattered some units from Fort Hood that in short order had made it to the Waco area, they now sought to make contact with the Army National Guard's 143rd Infantry Regiment in the downtown area itself, about to have been deployed to the regional airport here, the Waco Regional Airport, but it never made it out of downtown when the invasion had kicked off. As it was now at midnight, the start of the invasion, with the anti-strike as well as the booting on of electronic warfare assets. And although these mixed military assets here, these are the mixed military forces, these triangles of two companies apiece, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, these were once the elements of the 4-9 Cav Squadron of the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Cav, and also the 91st Brigade Engineering Battalion of the 1st Brigade within 1st Cav, and also 2-3 ACR, or the 2nd Squadron of 3rd ACR. So these were all mixed units. There was everything, and even a few of the rifle companies from the 3rd Brigade of 1st Cav that had been doing their dismounted patrol training, as they were all doing interoperability training during the Fort Hood battle with different other portions of the different brigades and even other battalions from other units when all of this had kicked off. If folks have watched that sub-series and remember, at the outset of the invasion, as the heavy artillery strikes had begun by other subunits of the 68th PLA Group Army that were down conducting that particular battle, as well as the Russian 2nd Combined Arms Army elements, such as the 16th Tank Division and the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, who also had artillery of their own and were conducting heavy artillery strikes as well in that battle, had caused the aforementioned American units to flee the area. After they had moved through Gatesville, most of them, although some did stray off to I-35 and were destroyed as a result, especially by a few battalions of the 13th Light Armor Brigade that, as they were arrayed in a crescent shape around this area, just to the south of Robinson, Texas, right here, off map, they were guarding, a few of their battalions were guarding the segment of highway that was between the Waco region as well as the Fort Hood area in general, as again, from Temple to Waco was 34 miles. From Gatesville to Waco area was 36 miles due to where they lay on the map. And this particular battalion belonging to the 38th Infantry Brigade was to the south as well, but moved into this area by the time this particular battle really got started in earnest, as all the actions occurring on this map really have started, although the artillery at exactly midnight had begun and some of the movements. Most of the major fighting on the map itself had started by 12:45 and 1 a.m. As the American forces had made their way into this area, these forces right here being those that fled Fort Hood, including also this one right here that made it through the gauntlet of fire and ended up over in this part of the city in Robinson after going under I-35, and they were about to be taken on by PLA forces that had moved into the area as well. Some of them starting off on CCP properties in the Waco area, while some were coming in from further away. The PLA forces had waited a little while to start doing their maneuver portions of the fighting because they had actually wanted to wait for their units to get into better jumping off positions to begin to capture the city. Because initially, though they had expected a little bit of enemy activity coming from Fort Hood and had planned accordingly for it, they had mainly wanted to focus their efforts initially on the 143rd Infantry Regiment, which was in the downtown area, and they wanted to prevent them from getting to their original mission, which they knew, as per cyber intelligence that they hacked, that they knew was to basically set up their base of operations in the Waco Regional Airport. Hence, they wanted to get the airport themselves as fast as possible. That was a highly coveted position, at least within this area, not just for defender, but also for the attacker, because this was to become a local megafob because of its proximity to I-35 and it being connected by a state route right here. There's like a state highway. And also because for conducting operations in tertiary areas, it was near a road to be able to go and do that, as well as linking it to I-35. And this area could accommodate larger aircraft, this regional airport, due to it having flights that connected to DFW International Airport. It could accommodate certain airliner levels of aircraft, so it could accommodate cargo planes easily. And that was of high importance to the PLA, especially when conducting future occupation operations, and also being connected to the vital logistical route coming from Mexico, not just for their external invasion prong, but later during the occupation. This would be a land-based vital logistical route into the country. This was extremely close to I-35, and for air logistical and troop rotations for future operations, as they would push out into tertiary areas that within the first 3 or 4 days would have not been taken as of yet, but would be later, as the forces would reconsolidate after taking their first objectives and put the rest of the whole country under their control, in other words. As I-35 would obviously need to be taken first, and every major city and medium city along it, and Waco was no exception. And they were preparing to do just that, as first on the list was the Waco Regional Airport, as well as cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes against the key defense contractors, such as the 3 different locations that L3 possessed, which worked on, for instance, aircraft and other types of sensitive communications equipment and electronic equipment, such as there being 2 sites near this TSTC airport right here, which was taken immediately by the logistical elements, the Independent Logistical Battalion and Headquarters Battalion, which was an independent HQ battalion over the whole 288th Light Infantry Division right off the bat, as the sites that were adjacent to it were hit by tactical ballistic missile strikes, as they were important to the American defense industries. Also, Raytheon had a site. SpaceX, United Technologies Corporations, and General Dynamics, they all had sites in Waco. So DH-10A cruise missile strikes coming from the 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces brigades right over the border that had been heavily bolstered by PLA Strategic Missile Forces reserve battalions, bolstering the active duty battalions that comprise these brigades by reinforcing them, making them larger to be able to fire additional systems such as the older ballistic missile systems such as the DF2s, 3s, and 4s, and also cruise missiles such as the widely available, widely produced subsonic DH-10A cruise missile systems, which had an extremely long range, and these reserve battalions that bolstered the numbers of these active duty battalions that comprise these active brigades that fired newer and still widely available systems, but not those systems, had now been bolstered so that these more available older systems could add to the highly available newer systems, making these brigades even more destructive than they would have been with just their active forces, because they had a lot of targets. So they only had a limited number of the newer systems available to them. They're just brigades. These are only 2 brigades. So bolstering them with additional battalions made it possible for them to fire at more targets all at the same time than having to wait longer amounts of time to circulate between different targets. There was also the 616th, and although the 616th wasn't bolstered by any reserve battalions, it still added significant weight to the firepower available, as there were many brigades of the strategic missile forces, many of them firing from Canada and also western Mexico at targets in the western United States, and those in Canada firing at targets throughout the eastern United States and northern United States, including the upper Midwest. But these 3 were specifically allocated to just these 3 states and part of Kansas as well, off map, and Colorado. But mostly these 3 states here. And these brigades, the 616th would fire a few tactical ballistic missiles within the Waco Battle as a Trojan unit. It would fire a few DF-11As that were shorter range, but still long range enough that Waco was easily covered by their range at some of these defense contracting sites, whereas the rest would be hit by the very long-range subsonic DH-10A cruise missiles fired by the reserve battalions that were equipped with those, besides the others that were equipped with the DF2s, 3s, and 4s, of which there were 3,400 of those tactical ballistic missiles when combining all their numbers together, with the DF2s and 3s being the most numerous, but the DF4s still available in the hundreds, in the low hundreds. As these forces on this particular map would be doing most of the fighting an hour into the invasion, 45 minutes or an hour in, after a 45-minute artillery preliminary barrage, as American forces from Fort Hood would enter the area through gaps that were either done purposely to let them in and trap them, or because the Chinese units hadn't arrived yet to plug those gaps, such as right here along I-35, as they were further south along I-35 at their CCP property they began at, as was the case with the spread out battalions of the 13th Light Armor Brigade, which is part of the 288th Light Infantry Division. They would move into the area and engage them, and also advance gradually inward into the city to engage their primary opponent as it related to their being their original opponent, which was the 143rd Infantry Regiment of the Texas National Guard. Although the arrival of these other American units, although they were by this point mixed units, as they had been harried and harassed all the way from Fort Hood till they arrived in this area, and there had been massive hunks eaten out of them as it related to their available equipment and vehicles, they still possessed enough to do some damage. And they would do some damage, as here at this Waco battle, the American forces present here would hang on for dear life, and this battle would actually last well into day 2, as the forces of the 143rd Infantry Regiment within the downtown area would, along with other forces, namely reactionary armed civilians and also some of the arriving American units from Hood, only a little would make it that far to the downtown area, would set up a perimeter and hold out. Although enemy forces would be coming from the Fort Hood area as well, in the form of a few battalions that had, after engaging the 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR, had pursued these forces into the Waco area, although they were hours behind, as by the time they engaged 1-3 ACR, it was later on in the first 4 hours of the Fort Hood battle, so they arrived at 5 a.m. into the area and then continued on to the fighting that would be in the downtown area, as by the time they arrived, much of the fighting on the periphery would have ended, but the battle would continue to rage in the downtown for quite some time, even with their addition of equipment and personnel to the fight. Although most of the coalition's air power on day 1 was tied up elsewhere, in lieu of this, the coalition forces essentially allocated armed high-altitude recon drones and armed combat drones in the form of 5 Wing Loon 2 drones. And of course, there was also the standard array of loitering munitions in the form of the Ch1nese that were produced in freakish quantities and available with every major headquarters battalion that had a dedicated drone section, which was virtually all of them. These would be used en masse to aid their ground forces as well. But Waco, like all the other battles, would be a hellish campaign. And although there were only 24,500 PLA troops of the units from the 68th Group Army that were here, with a few battalions from the 16th Tank Division to arrive later by 5 a.m., and the rest of the 68th Group Army fighting down in Fort Hood, along with the rest of the 2nd Combined Arms Army of the Russians. The forces fighting here, which after the arrival of the Russians would be over 24,500, it would be approximately 26. the casualties would be heaviest among the civilian population. Not just against the reactionary armed civilians that would fall in their thousands, but also those that would die in the crossfire. Although many more would flee at the first signs of combat when the first artillery shells began to fall on large parts of the city. And after hour number 4, the PHL-03 longer range 300mm rocket systems, although they weren't the longest range China possessed, as their longest range, the A300, was the longest range rocket artillery system in the world, an artillery system at all, because rocket artillery was the longest range. The PHL-03s had an 80-mile range and could reach both from Fort Hood, the fighting going on in Waco, and in the Austin battles as well, and would be utilized to support both from the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade of the PLA 68th Group Army. More to come in the next video of this battle subseries of the nationwide invasion and its south-central invasion sector, hypothetical 4th-generation warfare educational invasion documentary series, The Battle of Waco.